Hi, I'm Christoph, and today we're going to have a look at some shaders I made for this storming ohmu scene from the Ghibli movie Nausicaa Valley of the Wind. It's one of the few Ghibli movies that has a hatched ink and paint effect, and I thought it would be cool to replicate this before Inktober ends, to have a Ghibli special. For this tutorial, I'm going to focus on the shaders that I used. The clouds and the smoke effects are covered in other tutorials that you can find in the description below. Before we dive into the shaders, let's maybe have a breakdown of this scene first. To make this ohmu, I started off of a ohmu I found on sketchfab by Arukos, and I heavily modified it to look like the way I wanted it to look. This is actually a static scene, and that means that the ohmu is not moving, but the wave texture is actually giving the illusion of speed. And the same goes for our puffs of smoke. These are actually static puffs of smoke, and I animate this controller to make it look like there is movement. Together added with the ohmu that is animated, we get this illusion of movement. I also want to point out that for the outlines, I used a Blender add-on called Outline Helper, which allows you to add outlines to multiple objects. And it also allows you to adjust it on multiple objects as well, which is very valuable. It's been developed by Feline Entity, and I'm going to link to the download in the description below. Also, feel free to check out his YouTube channel because he has some really cool tutorials as well. Now, these are the shaders that we are going to make today. One is for the outer shell. The other is going to be for the eyes. Then we are going to use a different shader for the tentacles. And I'm also going to show you what I did to make this animated speed sand effect. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's start a new blend file. Let's delete the cube, delete the camera. We're going to keep the light, and we are going to add an icosphere. Let's give it a subdivision surface modifier to give it some more geometry. And let's set it to object shade smooth. And let's dive into the shader editor. Let's delete the principled BSDF, and let's add an emission shader. The first thing we're going to do is to turn this into a very basic cell shader. To do this, we're going to add a diffuse BSDF. Let's plug it into the emission shader. This is going to generate an error, but don't worry. We're going to add a converter shader to RGB. And this is going to convert our shader into colors. And now we can also manipulate the colors. So we will add a color ramp right behind the shader to RGB. And we can set it to a hard edge. And this will give us a basic cell shader. This will also interact with the light because of the diffuse BSDF we used. Next up, we're going to turn this into an ink shader by adding some hatching. For this tutorial, I drew my own hatching, and we are going to use a texture I made. This is a repeatable texture, and you can download it for free from my Gumroad if you follow the link below in the description. So let's drag it into the blend file. And we are going to add a mix RGB node. Gonna plug it in. And then we are going to set it to soft light. Now the hatching is of course way too big. So we're going to add a mapping and a texture coordinate node. And we are going to scale the texture. It is a repeatable texture, so we can scale it as big or as little as we want. I'm going to set it to 10 for now. And this turns this into a basic cell shader with some hatching. Next up, we're going to add some paint to this shader. So let's start by disconnecting our hatching shader. And we are going to add a Voronoi texture. We are going to plug the color into a color ramp. And let's plug this into our emission shader so we can see what we're doing. We're going to set the Voronoi to a smooth F1. And for now, let's turn down the smoothness. And we're going to mix it with our diffuse BSDF shader to get also a bit of our shading into the paint. To do this, we're going to add a mix RGB layer. We are going to plug our color ramp into the lower color node, and we are going to plug the shader to RGB node into our mix node. Let's set the mix node to soft light. And then to turn this into a paint shader, we're also going to add a color ramp after the soft light. And let's add some colors. For the darker color, we're going to select a dark green. And for our light color, we're going to use a beige color. This soft light now will control our paint strokes, and we're going to set the scale to 10. This will give us some finer paint strokes. And then something we want to do is we want a variable smoothness, because usually paint has a varied edge where it varies between more soft and hard edges. To do this, we are going to add a color ramp and a noise texture. Plug the FAC of the noise texture into the color ramp, and let's plug the color ramp into the smoothness of our Voronoi texture. And if we set our color ramp to something like this, we get some soft blurry edges and some hard edges. And to give it some texture, we can up the scale on our noise texture, and this will give it some extra grit give it a more painterly feel. If we bring the color ramp even more together, we get even more texture. And this is starting to look a bit like painted dots, which is nice. And then on top of this, I also want to add some speckles. To do this, we're going to add a musgrave texture. Plug in a mix RGB node right after color ramp. And let's plug in this musgrave texture. We're going to set the scale to 40. And then we are going to add a color ramp. And by controlling this color ramp, we can get a speckled effect. Let's maybe set the scale to 25. And this will give us our basic paint layer. Let's add our ink back into the paint. To do this, we're also going to add a mix RGB node. Plug in the color ramp from our ink. And we are going to set the mix RGB to multiply and set it to maximum. We can also control where the edge of the ink begins by controlling this color ramp. And then also we can control how much of the hatching is showing by controlling the soft light that's in front of it. And that's it. That's our basic shader that we use for our ink and paint. Let's have a look how it looks on the ohmu. And as you can see, this gives exactly the effect that we want. It is fully interactive with the light, which is nice. And it also interacts really well with these crevices. Next up, we're also going to make these eyes. I'm going to add a second sphere. Let's put it to shade smooth. Add the new shader. Let's delete the principled BSDF. And like last time, we're going to add a emission shader. And again, we're going to start off with a basic cell shader. We're going to add a diffuse BSDF. Let's plug it into our emission shader. And let's add a shader to RGB node to turn it into a color. And then we're going to add a color ramp. We are going to pick a light red for the basic color. And then where the highlight is, it is actually darker. So we are going to add a darker red. The eyes actually have a specular going on, and they're also a bit dotted or grainy, and we're going to replicate this in our scene. To add the specular to our cell shader, we are going to add a specular shader, and then we're going to add in a mix RGB node. Let's plug it in, and of course we need to add a shader to RGB node here as well. Let's set this to screen, and now our specular needs to have a base color that is black, and we can set our specular to a white. Let's back it down a bit and then play around with the roughness until we're happy. We want something that is a bit matte and less shiny. And now we are going to add the grainy effect. To do this, we're going to add a noise texture, add a mix RGB node, and let's just plug it into the mix RGB node. And we are going to set it to soft light. Set it to maximum value. And let's crank up the scale on our noise texture. Let's start with 100. We can even go to 200 if we want a more detailed look. I'm gonna set it to 150 for now. And we can also add this noise texture to our color as well. To do this, I'm going to add a mix RGB node after the color ramp. You could also do it before the color ramp. I'm gonna set it to soft light, plug in our noise texture, and as you can see, we have a graininess control for our specular, and then we also have a graininess control for our red gradient. And that will be the basic shader for our eye. Next up, we are going to make this cell shader for the tentacles. Let's add another sphere. I'm going to set it to shade smooth. Delete the principled. Add an emission. Let's turn this into a cell shader. So like last time, we're going to add a diffuse, add a shader to RGB, plug it into a color ramp, and let's plug it into our emission shader. And for this, we want a hard cell shade. So I'm going to set this color ramp to constant. And this is going to give us a very hard edge. We're going to use 3 colors. Let's select green. And then we're going to select a middle green. That's a bit darker. And then for our shadows, we're just going to leave it pitch black. And this is a basic cell shader. Now we want to add also a bit of the hatching, but we just want some random hatching here and there. To do this, we're gonna drop back in our hatching texture. We are going to add a mix RGB node. We're gonna multiply, set it to multiply. We're going to set it to multiply, maximize it. We're also going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And let's set the scale to 10. Or maybe for this one, let's set it to 5. And now we're going to create a mask. Let's add a mix RGB node. And then we are going to add a noise texture. We are going to plug the FAC into our mix node. And actually what we want to do is we're going to plug the noise into the upper color. And then we're going to set the mix node to screen. And this is going to act like a mask for our hatching. And to give it a sharp edge, let's add a color ramp. And just set it like this. And let's maybe set the scale of our hatching to something like 8. And our noise we can set to 10. And this is going to give us a shader that has some random little hatching marks on there. And this is going to be our shader for the tentacles. Next up, we're going to make this movement shader. And this actually gives us the illusion that the ohmu is moving. It is actually a ring wave texture that is moving towards the center. So let's start building this. Let's add a plane. And let's add a new shader. Again, we're going to turn this into a cell shader. So let's add an emission shader, a diffuse shader, a shader to RGB node, and a color ramp. I'm going to set it to constant. And let's select a color for the sand. And then we're going to set a color for the shadows. So this is going to cast some brown shadows now. And with the color ramp colors, we have control over this, like a basic cell shader. To add the waves, we are going to add a wave texture and a mix RGB node. We're going to set the mix RGB node to a screen. And let's plug in the color of our wave texture. And we're also going to add a color ramp. We can control the edge of our wave. I'm going to set it to something like this. And I want something that emanates like a circle. So we're going to set the bands setting to rings, and we're going to set it to Z as our value. To set the rings to the middle of our texture, we're going to add a mapping and a texture coordinate node. And if we plug in the object value into our vector, the rings will emanate from the center. I'm going to set the scale to something like 2 or 1 for now. And then of course we want this striping effect to go on. And to do this, I'm going to add a Voronoi texture. Let's plug it into a mix RGB node, and let's use the distance. Let's also add a mapping and a texture coordinate node. I'm gonna set the scale to 50 or maybe even 100. And now we're going to set the scale of our Voronoi to something like 100. Let's maybe back off the scale on our Voronoi to a 50. Yes. And as you can see, this gives this striping effect, which is pretty cool. We can make the striping more of a hard edge by controlling this color ramp. Also, you can control the size of the bands by using this color ramp. And of course, by changing the scale of our Voronoi, you can choose how large the stripes are. And to animate this, we have a phase offset option on our wave, which basically just controls the movement of this wave. And we're going to add a driver. To do this, click on the phase offset and add hashtag frame. And now if we press spacebar, we get this crazy speed effect. If you want to slow it down, you can set it to frame divided by, for instance, 4. This is going to slow it down by 4. But for this, I want a really crazy and speed effect, so I'm just going to set it to frame. And that's all there is to it. And this is going to give this classic anime speed stripes effect. And that concludes this tutorial. I'm going to leave the source files in the description below. I hope this inspires you to build your own shaders inspired by your favorite scenes, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, and see you next time.